I will send the YouTube link in the Zoom chat, so you will feel free to share it as well. It's almost done. Yep, should be this here. And you can all share or do whatever you want with it. Okay, without further ado, we will have to, we can just wait for our third participant, I guess. So let's start. So first, foremost, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to have you all here, and especially with people from so many different places and time zones. And I hope everything works well today. But anyways, just like to introduce us. GEM here, or GEM, we are a group of students, I guess, of medieval history, mostly. And we were a group composed by undergraduate students, graduate students, and professors alike, currently centered on the State University of Montes Claros, Minas Gerais. And we're doing this permanent series of talks with international scholars about medieval stuff, medievalism, but also modern stuff. And well, I guess it's all connected in a way. And I believe we'll talk a lot about it today because witches and the Middle Ages are oftentimes associated, even when they shouldn't, maybe. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first panelist, who will be Gwendolyn Knight. Gwen, go ahead.
Oh, okay, that was the introduction. Fair enough.
Yeah, sorry.
No worries. So hello everyone. It's delightful to be speaking here again. I also had the pleasure of giving a seminar around this time of year, surprisingly enough, for GEM last year. I am a postdoc at Stockholm University, and just to kind of give a little bit of an introduction to my approach to the topic of witchcraft in the Middle Ages, my research has mostly coalesced in three main areas, and two of them, Ireland and early medieval England, are towards the earlier end of the Middle Ages, and then my research in Scandinavia is a little bit on the more towards the High Middle Ages, and edging into up to the Reformation. So both covering quite a long period of time, but also in certain ways quite distinct from each other. My research, especially in early medieval England, integrates both archaeological and historical sources, and the project that I'm currently working on now in Stockholm looks at witchcraft legislation in the Scandinavian medieval laws. So that's Scandinavia, including Iceland, and there, with all of the written sources that we have, regardless of kind of which one that I'm looking at, it's very important to keep in mind precisely what kind of sources these are from the perspective of whose perspective we have in them, and that is to say that many of them are written from a particularly elite perspective, and that they are focused on certain on representing certain images of magic and witchcraft, which can make it difficult to say very much that is concrete about actual practice. And to this degree, working specifically with the medieval Scandinavian laws is quite helpful for cross-cultural comparisons within a certain region, because it is a coherent and related body of texts with a so even if the laws were in effect for a longer period of time, they sort of have a contemporary focus. I've also worked with the Icelandic sagas, and one difficulty there is, of course, that even though they often represent, normal-ish people, not just elites who work with magic, they often are looking into the past, and there it becomes quite complicated to be able to say exactly what image of magic we're getting from these sources, and that so this sort of complicated issue of sources, combined with needing to work between disciplines, how archaeology and history have interpreted magic of witchcraft, and also within Scandinavian research, kind of working between different languages, and how concepts of magic and witchcraft get translated through each other within scholarship, has sort of sent me down a theoretical rabbit hole, which I haven't really gotten out of kind of ever again, which is asking, kind of continually asking, when we're talking about magic and witchcraft and scholarship, what exactly are we actually talking about? And especially when we identify magic in sources, talking about the magic that we see in the sagas being at odds with a kind of magic as set up by more sort of self-consciously Christian sources like homilies or sermons, for example. What is it really that is substantively, what really is the substance of what we're analyzing? How do we identify magic in medieval sources? And as you can imagine, this makes me tons of fun at parties. So sort of bringing all of this kind of back around to the questions that Louise gave us as a kind of departure point for our presentations. What is a witch in the context of my research? The short answer is, I don't know. And that's partially because what's interesting about the word witch in English is precisely its kind of historical development, and the precursors to witch and witchcraft in Old English putatively referred to this kind of magical practice more broadly. The specific the specific definitions and connotations that it began to attain kind of in the later the later Middle English and into the early modern period is difficult to see kind of as a thing in Old English, And this also ties into to what our sources are and what they can really tell us, because we have, when we talk about magic and witchcraft, we have certain assumptions about what it is we're talking about, and why we don't have to define these words for whatever reason. And very often these kind of project a particular sensibility regarding particularly women, that can certainly be read into a lot of sources that we have, but might not be entirely really what our sources are telling us. So I would probably say, in the context of my research, I, generally speaking, try to avoid calling anyone a witch, mostly because this feels like an imposition of vocabulary and of preconceptions about the people that I'm talking about, which for me is difficult to reconcile with the material that I'm actually looking at. And that's not to say that there weren't people who or we don't really have very much in the way of court records that would tell us how particular laws against people who are using magic or divination of various kinds actually kind of experienced fear or any kind of oh gosh, how would you put it, judicial consequences for their actions. But there is a preoccupation, perhaps not as significant as is kind of sometimes when you really focus on witchcraft, it's really easy to sort of make it look like a much bigger thing in legal material than it necessarily is. I mean, you kill someone, whether by physical means or non-physical means. This is this is something that speaks to interpersonal conflicts, that they needed to be resolved in some way, and that some sense of again, invisible or intangible harm is very much a thing. But on the other hand, also the sort of the identity building of the early Christian church, wherein the concept of magic was very important in kind of creating a, this is our community and these are the people who are outside it. And in places like early Christian Ireland, so the early Middle Ages, and then early medieval England, where most of the written sources that we have are post-date the mission sent by Pope Gregory the Great. These ideas of needing to create and maintain a Christian community are very much still at the forefront of people's minds. And a little bit later, once a sort of more Reformation-minded spirit comes in, and by Reformation I don't mean the Reformation, I mean the Benedictine reforms of the of the 10th and of the 10th century, so considerably earlier. So I don't know if magic was, if we can necessarily talk about magic being feared, because we don't have these kind of particularly local sources, but magic was definitely and was definitely a tool that people could use, and emotions connected to it of fear and wonder were certainly employed in this context, be it implicitly or explicitly. Let's see here. And the other question, yes, how does it relate to today's ideas or stereotypes about witchcraft? So the sources that I work with for early medieval England and Ireland, I would say they don't specifically feed in particularly much to today's ideas or stereotypes about witchcraft. I think medieval Irish epic literature plays into a lot of excuse me. Sorry, one of my four-legged research assistants is making a little bit of trouble. Yes, Irish epic literature certainly plays into a certain corner of the general interest in mythology that we see today, and the representations of Irish mythology can vary in don't necessarily want to say accuracy, because we don't really have anyone who's kind of sat down and in the Middle Ages and written a detailed list of Irish mythology, but in their attention to the sources they come from, they can vary quite a bit, and Louisa will probably be able to speak to this a bit more than I can, but in Sweden, at least, the interest in the medieval laws, which are at least in Sweden, not as much in for example, Iceland, the primary source for any kind of witch thoughts about witchcraft, ideas about witchcraft, they don't tend to be particularly interesting to stereotypes of witchcraft, at least in the Nordic countries. They're mostly interesting for a lot of researchers as the kind of stepping stone to the witch trials, but in a certain way, this kind of speaks to the part of what people really like about looking to the past for in order to construct ideas of witchcraft today, because it's this very haziness and this sort of not knowingness that's really quite attractive, because then you can kind of go in and say, well, I can put together kind of whatever picture these shadows make, more or less, which in a way is great. It's awesome that people are interested in this and want to engage in this. As a historian and an archaeologist who works with this material, it can, however, make it a little bit interesting to sort of try to talk to people about this, because you have to kind of feel out exactly where they're approaching your topic from, and then sort of separate out a few of the threads and sort of start there before you really jump into what you're talking about. I think that was more or less as much as I had planned to say. Louise, I think I can hand the...
Okay, thank you, Gwen. And hi, Ronald. I'm so sorry you had issues with Zoom. to join, but I'm glad you're here now. Can you hear us? All right.
Yes, I can. Yeah, and now you should be able to hear me.
Yeah.
I've actually had not only to open my own Zoom account, but to set up a completely new email account and address in order to join this gathering, because it regarded my university email, which you have been using and is my standard address, as invalid. It simply wouldn't recognize it, and I couldn't unblock it. So that's why it's taken me 3/4 of an hour to set up 2 new accounts in order to join.
I'm so sorry for the trouble, but well, I'm just glad you're here. And well, we have agreed on making the order Gwendolyn, then Louise, then you. So now I'm gonna pass the word to Dr. Louise Kelstrup. I still try to. And
thank you very much. I will just try and share my screen. And this worked just before, so hopefully it will again. So I hope that you can see only one slide in just a second. I just need to, it's all this technology. So yes, I hope that you can see my first page and not my notes. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. And this is truly a global event. I was just enjoying all the highs and hellos from all over the world. So I guess Zoom and virtual meetings can do a thing for us. So thanks again. Yes, I will spend my minutes on a very introductory talk about Denmark, because I work mainly on Danish witchcraft and Danish witchcraft prosecutions, and I guess not many of you are all that familiar with Danish witchcraft, maybe even not Danish history. So I will just shortly introduce my own work, and I'll see if I can do something here. And I am an associate professor of early modern history in Odense, and now my screen says something it shouldn't. So yes, in Odense, which is in the middle of Denmark, University of Southern Denmark, and I'm also the director of Center for Medieval and Early Modern Studies. Okay, officially Renaissance studies, but that's a compromise between the literates and the historians. So, and I have, I think my most accessible work to an English-speaking audience will be my book, Agents of Witchcraft in Early Modern Italy and Denmark. And I've edited a number of volumes. One of them is Contesting Orthodoxy in Medieval and Early Modern Europe, focusing on heresy in witchcraft and magic. And then for the Danish-speaking audience, I've written 2 books. Heksejagt means witch hunt in Danish, and A Pact with the Devil is the last one. So I've worked on witchcraft and mainly from the position of or the approach of witch prosecutions, and I will just introduce that in 1 minute. So I think my research stands on 2 legs. I've worked quite a lot on Italy. I worked for many years on the Roman Inquisition, where I did a case study on Orbetello, which is that small town on almost, you can see it here on, I'm not sure I can show it to you here, but it's the one down here. It's a Spanish garrison state in the mid-17th century, where the Roman Inquisition enters the town and sends out an edict for heresy, and after that it explodes in accusations of especially love magic. And you can probably imagine that with a Spanish garrison, there's a whole lot of Spanish soldiers, and in Italy, as we all know, at that point in time, we have just a majority of single women. So this is very much love magic that is prosecuted here, and entirely by the Roman Inquisition. In my book, Agents of Witchcraft, I did a comparative study of that case, Orbitello, with the Danish case of witchcraft, and I was actually puzzled by what you were saying, Gwen, that what I studied here was really, what did they mean when they talk about witchcraft? What did authorities mean when they talked about witchcraft? Not so much magic, but more witchcraft. And what did people mean? What caused suspicions of witchcraft? Why did they accuse each other of witchcraft? And how did they see and regard the local courts? It was clear to me that in Italy as well as in Denmark, they saw the court, whether it would be the Inquisition or the Danish secular courts, as a room for negotiating conflicts, but this fell out very differently because, well, the origins of the courts were very different. For the past 6-7 years, I've been working exclusively on Denmark and Danish witchcraft. And I brought a map of Denmark because those of you who are familiar with Denmark today know that it is only this tiny half island and the 2 other islands and all the small islands. But in the 16th and 17th century, Denmark is actually quite a large state in Europe, and we have a king in the early 17th century who thinks he will be the one saving Europe from the 30 Years' War. So he is the lion from the north. So this is a very potent kingdom, at least in the king's own regard, or what he thinks of himself. So and now I'm just about to start a new project on godly power and witchcraft, where I'll be looking together with my research group on the entire kingdom of Denmark with all its realms. So yes, so that was just a bit about my research, and so you know where I'm coming from. Now over to the questions that Louise gave us. First of all, I think what's important for my research and what a witch is in my context is that, as I mentioned before, I approach witchcraft from the prosecution position. So I'm in my research, I've not been that interested in the witch as a figure outside the court. I'm more interested in what motivates authorities and co-villagers and local authorities to prosecute. So that is kind of my approach to this. So a tiny bit about Denmark first. Denmark was a state of moderate prosecution in Denmark. We had about 2,000 trials in the entire kingdom of Denmark, Norway. And I've used the chronological scope of 1530 to 1693, and that's because we have not any preserved trials before 1530. And of course we have the Reformation, Lutheran Evangelical Reformation in 1536. And after that, witch trials are entirely brought to secular courts. So the church is hardly a consultant in this. They're not brought in trials, but they work as consultants to the king and the council when they form the laws or formulate the laws. We have an execution rate of about 50%. And execution was always burning people alive until the last execution in 1693, where the culprit was hanged before she was burned. Also, I should mention that about 90% of the people or the persons tried for witchcraft were women. So about 10% men. Well, so What is a witch? Well, in the context of prosecution, I think what's important in Denmark is to mention the Lutheran celebrations in 1617. This is where Christian IV, the king, issues this comprehensive law prohibiting all kinds of magic, beneficial magic as well as harmful magic. Harmful magic has, of course, been forbidden for centuries. So in the secular law of 1617, issued in October 1617, witchcraft was explicitly defined as an offense against God. It presents witchcraft as two kinds of sins. We have the true witches; they are the ones entering a pact with the devil. And then we have the secret arts, that is healing magic and divination. And this is presented as the first alphabet of every witch, so this is kind of the first step onto the path of eternal condemnation or damnation. And this is a sentence that we also find with Niels Hemmingsen, the prominent theologian of Denmark. So and the punishments are also laid forward in this law. There are no mercy for true witches. They are the ones sent to the stake to be burned alive. And then if you are sentenced for practicing secret arts, you will be exiled from the entire kingdom and all of its realms. So we have some quite harsh punishments for witchcraft, and much harsher than the ones in the Italian case study I did earlier. So yes. So if we talk about what the witch is in this context, there's of course there's the macro threat. This is the witch is a threat to godly society, provoking God's wrath. She's entered, and mainly she, but the law is gender neutral. She's entered a pact with the devil, and to the monarch, it's a divine duty to eradicate all witches, because in the main goal for him is to secure the salvation of his subjects. But of course, as in many of these trials or cases in early modern Europe, the trials for witchcraft are basically always initiated from below. So on the micro level, it's a completely different situation. We do not find accusations of God's wrath, and we do not find that much fear for pacts with the devil. It's much more about what we would refer to as the village witch. She's doing harm to people, she's doing harm to livestock, and she's feared. And she's feared for her evil will, for her anger, for her envy, and her intention to doing harm. So she's very much a feared figure. And this is also the one we see in the court records, which is kind of in a contrast to the formal judicial the laws. So, but of course, these I'm not advocating for this kind of old school dichotomy of a learned and a popular idea of witchcraft, but we have, at least in the court records and in the law, we have these two forms of witches. And then we have a third one, which I think is, and I'm sure Gwendolyn knows a lot more about this than I do, but we have this Nordic folklore which represents these strong evil women. This has been an argument from Stephen Mitchell. And these women, we see them here at the two church paintings. The one is from Sweden and the other one is from Denmark. These tales of strong evil women we can see that these figures are fusing with the more popular ideas, but also with the theologians' writings about witchcraft. They address these stories, especially the one with the shoe Ella that you see on the left, who's so evil that even the devil fears her. So when he has to hand her shoes as a reward for all her evil deeds, he has to do it on a stick because he's so scared of her. So in short, the witches in the court cases are, with no exceptions, evil, and they're feared, and they were harming others, and they were creating fears. And then there's a variation of witches, which are the cunning people or the cunning folk, and they are the ones that are targeted with the label of secret arts. But the ones we come across in the court records are always accused of true witchcraft or having sort of harmed people. And these cunning people in the court records are always feared too, but they're also needed. But they're essential to local society due to their cures, especially their abilities to practice counter magic. And then in Denmark, we have two exceptions, because I said that in Danish witch trials, it's always about harming livestock or making children or people sick. But we have two exceptions, and one of them are the bridal journey of Anna of Denmark, who's to marry James VI in 1589, where there are a series of trials regarding weather magic. This is uncommon in a Danish context. So this idea of a diabolical conspiracy casting storms down to prevent Anna from reaching the shores of Scotland. And the other exception, and this is the biggest case, but we have some smaller cases representing a demonic possession. Tistel in 1696, 1698. Originally a case about possession. It's a big scandal in northwestern Jutland, a case about possession and witchcraft, but it ultimately ends up with verdicts against the presumed witches for fraud instead. And this is what puts a sort of the formal stop to witchcraft trials in Denmark at the end of the 17th century. And then I thought about the last question you posed, Louise. How does it relate to today's ideas and stereotypes about witchcraft? I think in Denmark, and I can only speak for Denmark, I think I am relatively often approached by journalists who want to know about the feminist witch, because new feminism makes use of this idea of the witch as a martyr for feminism, and she died on the stake in her fight against patriarchy, and this is very much a story that circulates in artistic and creative circles in Danish society, definitely spurred on by a horrible book, sorry, don't quote me for that, by Silvia Federici. But this is clearly a narrative that circulates among creative circles in Denmark, but also among yes, let's stick to that. And then, so I think that's one kind of witch identity that is taken on in Denmark today. And I think I've disappointed quite a lot of journalists when I say that there are no direct connection between the witch trials in Denmark and the woman dying on the stake in her fight against patriarchy. And then I think, and I've met that quite a lot, also among students, that these, I call them insta witches. I'm not sure if that's the right label to put on it. And I found an Instagram witch group, but where I think they take on the identity of a witch also as a rebel figure, a bit like the feminist witch, but where they think about or they use the witch as a label to, or sort of a, I'm not sure what you call it, but a way of saying, well, I too stand outside the norms of society, and I stand up for myself, and I believe in myself, and I will not conform to what society orders me to do. And I think that's something different than that feminist stereotype witch. But we can talk much more about that. I think I will stop here. Yes, thank you. We'll unshare.
Well, thank you, Louise. That was great. And I think you already have some questions ready for you in the chat, but well, without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Ronald Hutton. And well, again, sorry for the trouble we gave you, Ronald. Floor is yours. You're muted.
Thank you. I'm here, folks. I broke through all the barriers. I vaulted the hurdles. I climbed the walls, and it's certainly worth it. So good evening. To tackle the 4 questions in order. First, the definition of witchcraft in my period of study. The problem here is I don't have a specific period of study. I'm too greedy. I make a joke that I specialize in the period between the Old Stone Age and the present day. Like my companions, I'm a historian, in my case at Bristol University in the west of England in the United Kingdom. And in looking at the way in which witchcraft is defined and studied and perceived through all the periods from ancient times, it's clear that there are 4 different definitions of a witch circulating in the modern world. 2 of them are very old and go back to the roots of the English language, and 2 of them are distinctly modern. The 2 older definitions have both been touched upon already. That first, a witch is a person who uses magic to harm others. So this person is seen as a danger, and witchcraft in this sense as an entirely negative, menacing, dangerous activity to society. That goes back to the Anglo-Saxons. The other old definition also goes back to the Anglo-Saxons, but it's rather different. And it defines a witch as anybody who uses magic for any purpose. So it not only includes those who use magic to harm others, but it includes those who use magic to help others, if often for a fee. So it includes the figures we've called cunning folk or wise folk, to which reference has been made already this evening. This definition was coined, I think, specifically by people who did not approve of magic, and used later by those who didn't believe in it. I can't find a case of the use of the word witch to include cunning folk or wise folk being made by people who actually believed in the services of cunning folk and wise folk. It's a smear tactic by people in authority, initially reforming churchmen, then reforming magistrates as well, to condemn positive magic, the magic which people believed as an aid, as just another form of witchcraft, even though they often denoted the well-behaved witches, the folk magicians, as good witches or white witches to differentiate them. But as I've said, both these different definitions go back to the roots of the English language. In addition, there are 2 modern definitions, both of which are 19th century, but which acquired extra traction in the 20th and retain them now. And the first is, and this has been touched upon again already, that a witch is a feisty, independent woman who stands up for female rights and is a figure of love and authority in the community and is persecuted and eradicated in order to re-establish the hold of patriarchy, sometimes joined with that of capitalism or aristocracy or theocracy. And the fourth and last definition, which is also 19th century, is that a witch is a practitioner of a surviving pagan religion, usually a religion of nature and feminism. And this has, of course, given birth to some extremely viable modern forms of religion under the name of witchcraft, particularly the oldest and best organized, known as Wicca. So those are the definitions. They're not compatible. They keep running into each other. They create endless confusion now, and they make research into the subject incredibly exciting. The second question, which is my experience of researching witchcraft. Well, I've had different experiences according to where I research it and what kind of witchcraft I consider. There's a huge constituency for research into the witch trials, which developed in the 1970s, is still going very strong, and of which Louise is an outstanding representative. There's also a growing and now very impressive body of research into witchcraft, broadly defined, in the ancient and medieval worlds, and Gwendolen is a distinguished contributor to the medieval component. So in neither of those cases did I find any difficulties, anything special about the experience that sets it off from the experience of researching anything else in the past. The standout experience I had was that of researching modern pagan witchcraft as another component of my work. I did this extensively in the 1990s, and I had a very great degree of trouble as a result, which was not found in any of my other areas of research. To give just a few examples, when I first started contacting modern pagan witches and asking for access to their records and memories, I was made very welcome. The only price which I had to pay, which was a delightful one, was to give talks on history to their conferences and their meetings. And at one of the first conferences I addressed, where I gave a paper wholly on a historical topic, I did not realize that there was a Church of England missionary in the audience in disguise, taking notes, because he regarded the growth of paganism in general and pagan witchcraft, or Wicca in particular, as being a threat to Christianity. And he went away shocked that an established academic should be addressing such a gathering, used his imagination a bit, and denounced what I had done to a national gathering of the Church of England, describing me as Professor of Celtic Studies at the University of Bristol, thereby giving me both a promotion and a wrong subject, and High Priest of modern pagan witchcraft, thereby bestowing in its way an equally glamorous promotion and unlooked for position upon me. Well, I'm laughing about it, but it was reported in the national newspapers, and my head of department called me in and told me that my research was in danger of bringing the department into disrepute, and therefore I might consider abandoning it. I told him that if the gentleman who'd spied on me could get my discipline and my title and my affiliation so completely wrong, there wasn't much else about which he could be right. And I had no intention of abandoning a worthwhile research project because of, bluntly, one idiot in a church conference. But it wouldn't go away. 3 years later, a job was advertised at my university and people were interviewed for it. And the successful candidate admitted to me later that the staple topic of conversation as the candidates were gathered together waiting to be called in to interview was that there was supposed to be a witch in the staff of the department, which they were hoping to join. And it got nastier. The following year, the student newspaper of the university asked to interview me about my research, with the story that they were interested in professors doing exciting new research, and I'd be one of a series. It was in fact a lie. It was instead an attempt by two young men who wished to establish their reputations as journalists with the more sensationalist national press to land a scandal story. So they came to me and I told them about my research. And the next week, there was a photograph of me in the front of the student newspaper, which said, "Warning, this man could be a witch," and then proceeded to suggest that witchcraft inherently must be devil worship, and any academic concerned in studying it in the present world must be implicated in this, and therefore I could be a very dangerous person. I didn't know what to do. To sue a student newspaper for libel is rather beneath the dignity of most academics. And none of my colleagues said anything to me about it, so I decided to ignore it and just carry on. But I noticed that after a few months, when the time came for me to get my annual increment of salary, which is the usual slight rise in pay that you get in the British system each year until you reach a certain level in each grade, and I didn't get it. It was withheld. And the only circumstances under which it can be withheld is that you fail in your duties or you bring the university into disrepute. And I had apparently been convicted under the second of those without a hearing. And the next year came and I still didn't get an increment. And the third year came and I didn't get an increment. So my salary had been frozen because of the student article. And I just thought that I would let my book on the subject come out and see what happened. And my book did come out and it got very good reviews and became well respected. And then suddenly I was given 3 years worth of extra salary in one go, without a word being said at any point. It was all very British. But in the wider sense, it was tough. When I put in for requests for research grants, whereas always before I'd got them, they are now being refused. I was no longer invited to address conferences of colleagues when a colleague of mine from America went to Cambridge University, the most prestigious in my nation, about 2001, and asked what was happening with me. The historians there told him he could forget about me because I'd gone mad, become a witch, and left the profession. And that's why everybody could now ignore me. But I kept on, and after a few years, even my research into modern witchcraft came to seem worthwhile, and the grants began coming back and the invitations began coming back, and the honours eventually arrived. But it was a trip through quite a dark valley to get there, and only because of what I was studying, not even because of what I'd written. Third question, why it is that witchcraft seems associated in the popular mind with medievalism and a vanished world? Well, largely because of the 18th century Enlightenment, where the philosophers decided that as magic didn't exist, a belief in both magic and witchcraft had to be a hallmark of superstition, ignorance, and backwardness. And so, in 18th century terms, by definition, medieval. So that was the century in which witchcraft became A, other, and B, older, as part of a broader rejection of magic. But witch hunting, if magic doesn't exist, suddenly becomes a crime against humanity in its own right, and was used by the philosophers of the 18th century and the early 19th to castigate, to lambaste the regimes of the traditional aristocracy and the established churches. And that motif goes through to the present, of the witch hunt as being the classic human paradigm from Western civilization of ignorance and barbarism, directed against innocent people in the cause of superstition and bigotry. But it also generated the idea that witchcraft was a surviving pagan religion, initially as a desperate attempt by reactionaries defending the traditional established churches and aristocracies and monarchical regimes as having been justified in persecuting people as witches. And their line of defense, which was based on very little research, was to suggest that the people persecuted as witches were surviving practitioners of an ancient pagan religion, but it was one of orgiastic sexual behavior, child sacrifice, and all the other crimes and misdemeanors which had been alleged against witches by those who brought them to trial in the Middle Ages, just with the literal belief in magic taken out. And then French radicals, French liberals, got hold of this idea and had to deal with it. And they did so quite simply by doing even less research into the historical records, but taking the same idea and reversing the sympathies. So they agreed that the witches persecuted in the witch trials had been practitioners of a surviving pagan religion, but they suggested it had been an appalling pagan religion. They suggest that far from being an appalling pagan religion, it was a religion of rebellion and wholly justified resistance to the repressive forces of the medieval church and state, feminist, nature-loving, and populist. This was just as much a myth as the reactionary view, but one that had more traction on the 20th century and went down in it, as said, to help give birth to some entirely viable and entirely praiseworthy modern religions. So to my last question, your last question to me, about the difficulties and the risks dealing with public perceptions of witchcraft in the present age. Well, there are lots of them, and they cluster around 4 different misconceptions of the history of witchcraft, which are rampant among the general public in many nations at the present day. And if you're going to be positive, make the study of past witchcraft even more exciting than all the other confusions and cross currents already do, such as the lingering belief that the people persecuted in witch trials were pagans, worshipping a religion of nature, such as the radical feminist belief from the 1970s, but still lingering in certain areas and among certain writers and website composers. And this has been referred to already, the idea that witch hunting was simply woman hunting, was simply a tool of the patriarchy. The third very common idea, which has been around since the Enlightenment, is the idea that nobody ever hunted witches because they really believed they were witches. There was always an ulterior motive. In other words, witch hunting had to be an excuse to take out somebody for another reason, like repressing women or repressing peasants or extending the power of your state or extending the power of your church. And this depends very much on the idea that witch hunting was a top-down process, that it's something instigated by and carried on by nasty people at the top of society and government, brainwashing or terrorizing the masses. And finally, the popular conception of witchcraft, which is perhaps most widespread, least discussed, and socially most dangerous, is the lingering belief that there's something real about witchcraft. It can take two forms. One is the hardly articulated, guilty, but very, very common idea that there is something uncanny in the world and in nature. And it just could be that people can actually work magic in some way, and that therefore evil people can cause occult harm. This is still surprisingly widespread, although it tends not to be discussed in front of strangers, and certainly not in public settings. But far more common is what you might call a modern version of it, which is a disbelief in the supernatural, but a persistent belief in hidden groups of enemies inside society who do engage in practice like child sacrifice, devil worship, and sexual misconduct in honor of a non-existent devil or a non-existent group of satanic deities. This occasioned a major explosion of popular panic in the 1990s, the fear of satanic ritual abuse, which began in America, creating a whole series of legal mistrials and tragedies, and spilled over into parts of Europe, including my own. So it's time now for me to wind up. I have 20 to 25 minutes. I've had 21. The obvious common theme here is that this is a live subject. It's electric. It's to be handled with care. If you're going to do it and you want to be safe, just stick to it before about 1940. And the further back you go, the safer you are. But it's loaded with so many cultural preconceptions, prejudices, and sometimes stark fears that we are dealing with very real and very live issues for modern society. And that's, of course, why what we're all doing is so worthwhile, and why, in my case, belatedly, it's so wonderful that we're here together tonight.
Okay, thank you, Professor. And well, thank you again for accepting our invitation after being, well, betrayed by past invitations like that. Thank you for your trust in us. And no, we will not make a sensationalist breaking news tomorrow about how we have exposed 3 witches. Without further ado, now we opened the round table. So if you have questions for each other and whatnot, comments, considerations, please go ahead. And if not, then we'll open to the public.
Both of my distinguished colleagues have given such splendid papers that I have no questions at all. I've just been taking notes.
Louise, Gwen, any questions or comments for each other? If not, then let's open the debate for everyone in the chat room. We're not getting a lot of traffic on YouTube, so I would just disregard that. Let's just keep it for archive. So if you have a question, please raise your hand in the Zoom app. If you're using it, it's under reactions, or you can just type in the chat, I have a question. Someone already did it, like said they had a question. So please just say, William Knight has a question. I'll just ask that you unmute your mic, William. You should be able to do that, and you can ask a question.
Yeah, this is a question for Gwen about early Irish sources specifically. Have you encountered very often kind of people in the popular imagination or social media spaces using the kind of historiography of hagiography of St. Patrick to make this account of some sort of massive persecution of practitioners of traditional Irish beliefs under St. Patrick, that kind of thing. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
That's a very interesting question. As far as I've countered references to early medieval Ireland in popular culture, I don't see a specific reference to St. Patrick come up very often. I think part of it is because that even though in the early hagiography, the hagiography that I work with is mostly pre-11th century, so that's only about three of the oldest ones, three of the oldest vitae that we have. He goes up against Druids occasionally, but there's not really any kind of persecution. It's more in a kind of context that the Druid performs some supernatural feat, but he can't control it. And so St. Patrick not only demonstrates that he can do a similar feat but better, but he can fix the problem that the Druid created. I don't very often encounter references to hagiography in popular culture interactions with medieval Irish literature.
Thanks.
Okay. Now Natalia has a question as well.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, that's great. So I have a question for Louise. You're talking about today's ideas about witchcraft. And my question is how we can describe in an honest and real way the witches or witchcraft in the movies or TV shows, or even in the classrooms as a teacher as well. That is my question. Thank you.
The witches of the past, or how we perceive witches today? I just
Both.
need to. I think first of all it's important to ask whose witches or what witches, because as I said in my presentation, the witch that I am working with, and I noted that Gwendolyn said, well, I don't really like calling them witches because I think that's my position. That's I don't like calling them witches either, but I know that somebody did. I think that it's very important to define from whose witch you're talking about. And if you're talking about a theologian from 16th century Denmark, then you would a witch will be someone who's entered a pact with the devil and using various rituals to manipulate supernatural diabolical powers. But I think if you talk to some of my students that I have who identify as witches, it's definitely not because they entered a pact with the devil. So I think it's a very subjective answer that you need to define what kind of witch you're talking about first. I also think that in Denmark, and I was very inspired by your talk, Hudson, and also yours, Gwendolyn, and in various ways, but all the four misconceptions that you mentioned, Ronald, there are some that I meet basically every time that I give a public lecture, and often at the end of the Q&A, people, one person put up the hand and they say, okay, but where were these witches truly? Where were they? So I think that yes, I think we need to define who's which and what kind of witch and in what period of time. And even when you define the period of time, you need to define that exact which that you talk about. I hope I make sense.
Yeah, yes, you do. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so again, just repeating, if you have a question, just raise your hand or type it in the chat. If you're not comfortable speaking, or if with your English, you can send the question either directly on public chat or in a direct message to me, and I can read the chat or translate it to the guests as well, to the best of my capacity, of course. So we have a question on the chat here, which is from Andresa, who asks Gwen to talk a little bit more about archaeological findings related to magic and witchcraft that you study.
Sure. I need to preface this a little bit by saying that the identification of at least some of these archaeological material as specifically relating to any kind of magic or witchcraft is in some cases something that is surmised in scholarship and not necessarily something that we have particularly a direct evidence for believing that to be magic or witchcraft related necessarily. So one thing that I study in an archaeological context is the use of amulets, and in the case of early medieval England, at least, still the greatest authority is Audrey Meany. Her scholarship is really, if you're interested in amulets in early medieval England or even Europe, because she draws a lot of cross-cultural comparisons. Her work is really the work to look up. One thing that I'm engaged in right now is doing a bit of a reassessment of what has been identified by Meany and others as cunning women burials. And these are burials of, like Louisa said in her material, mostly women, not always, but mostly, who have been buried not only with putatively amuletic objects, but with a particular little collection in a bag or a box by their left leg. In some cases, for example, Andrew Reynolds has sort of extended this a little bit by showing that there's a certain overlap between women who are buried with this particular little kit and who have also, for example, been buried prone or have been buried covered in, packed with stones, and sort of drawing this in as an extra element of the kind of potential marking out of these women in the burial record. The difficulty that we have with this particular set of archaeological evidence is that, particularly in England, these burials both begin and end prior to the written records that we have for magic in England. And of the written records that we have, we can kind of find, little bits here and there, which, might, oh, hello, research assistant, which might connect to them in some way, but don't really refer to them specifically, which means that the sort of, it's very attractive to interpret these burials as cunning women, as the cunning or wise women that Ronald was talking about. But to a certain degree, this is, to a certain degree, it is still speculation. And so the reassessment that I'm doing is trying to update and catalog exactly what burial evidence we currently have, and to sort of tie it into this theoretical rabbit hole that I have been down, and seeing if I can kind of bring that to bear on the burial evidence. Sorry, that went off on a bit of a tangent. I hope I answered your question.
Okay, I know Louise has raised her hand, but before I give her the word, I just have a question I think everyone is asking inside. And what is the name of the research assistant?
So I have two research assistants. They're both named after Egyptian goddesses. So the one who interrupted me while I was speaking earlier is Isis, and the one who was sitting on me just now is Newt.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Louise, go ahead, please.
I'm sorry I didn't bring the black dog. We were talking about that just before you came in, Ron, that we have black cats and black dogs as research assistants. No, I was actually, to my co-panelists, I was wondering, because in Denmark, I've noticed there's been this development according or sort of parallel to this need for making apologies on behalf of the past and the past actions. And the Danish government, for instance, recently apologized for boys treated horribly in a horrible children's home in the 1950s and 60s, and now we are apologizing to Greenland, but they refuse to apologize for the Caribbean islands and the slaves. And we have these discussions in Denmark, and along with this, I've noticed that. And I can give an example, because I've noticed more attention about the witchcraft trials too. And I know about these rehabilitations of witches around Europe. And an example from Denmark, which is often not taking things so seriously. But every summer, midsummer, we burn bonfires on St. John's Eve. And for about 15 years, this is my usual 15 minutes of fame among Danish journalists, because they call me and they want to know the story about witchcraft trials. And I explain to them, well, this is not us, because on top of these bonfires, we put a doll on a broomstick. And this is a fairly new tradition, about 100 years old. It came from Germany, and it's representing evil. And 10 years ago, I was always asked, well, what was the connection? Are we celebrating these witchcraft trials? And I would say, no, this is a pre-Christian tradition. But for the past 5 years, I've been asked, well, do you actually do you like that? Do you think that's okay that we celebrate witch trials? So I think this has taken a turn for people trying sort of to ban these bonfires, because instead of searching for what are we celebrating, they're taking the position at once saying, well, we should not celebrate the horrible deeds of the past. And I was just wondering if you find these kind of trends in England, and for you, Gwendolyn, in Ireland and England and Sweden as well.
Who'd like to respond first? Would you like to, Gwen?
I feel like I've talked quite a lot already. If you would like to hop in first, please be my guest.
This is an issue in the United Kingdom, particularly in Scotland, which had much more intense witch trials than other parts of Britain. It's an issue which so far is the work of particular small lobby groups, who usually have one reputable lawyer attached to each. But so far, they're not mass movements. And the lobbies concerned are in dialogue with local and central government. It's a relatively new conversation. and I'll be interested to see what comes out of it. I have so far resisted getting involved myself, even when the parties concerned have invited me to do so, partly because I have so much other trouble in my life already that taking on this issue on top is just a bit too exhausting. But also because I don't feel strongly about reparations from misconduct more than about a couple of generations old. Because to a late 20th, early 21st century liberal humanist, almost everybody is dreadful before about 1800. And most people remained so until about the middle of the 20th century. So if we issue formal pardons for those put to death as witches, are we supposed to pardon the Catholics and the Anabaptists and every other type of wrong religion, the Lollards who got burned at the stake for having the wrong opinions? Do we pardon people put to death for treason, when many of the causes they embraced would be regarded as acceptable these days? Do we issue an apology to the animal kingdom for all the bears and bulls who were tortured to death in public for entertainments? Once you accept that people before about 1800 were a lot more brutal than we are now, and believed in different cosmologies and had different priorities, trying to invade their realm becomes a lot more difficult. But all the same, nor would I be worried if a public apology were issued by some authority in Scotland for the witch trials.
Yes, I think similarly, the only real reference that I have in a British or Irish context is the memorial that was recently set up in Orkney. And the kind of, I suppose that was a comparatively informal way of interacting with the past. But beyond that, I mean, every once in a while, like in when is it? I believe it's around Easter, is it, in Sweden, when you're supposed to do something to be prevented from being taken off to Blåkulla. I'm probably misrepresenting that. My brain has gone a little bit mush after a month of very intensive teaching, but you know, then it's not really, you know, no one's asking for any kind of apology or you know, reckoning with the past. It's more presented as a kind of, you know, ooh, look at this edgy thing from the past that we can interact with today. You know, in I find that at least in Sweden, there appears to be a tendency to reach for the Old Norse, partially pre-Christian past in the nationalist movement. And you know, and of course there are people, you know, who consider themselves Ausatru, who don't engage with nationalism at all. Like I don't mean to kind of say, you know, if you're into pre-Christian religion, you're a white nationalist. That is absolutely not the case. However, the degree to which the two overlap is uncomfortable, and I feel like the interest in the witch trials in Sweden, it is an interest, but to the degree of, you know, trying to reckon with the past, the one that people are kind of tiptoeing around and occasionally making noises about really tends to be more the this image of you know, the pre-Christian Nordic religions that that we get from mostly from the saga literature.
we have Francisco and then Richard. Francisco, if you could unmute.
Hi, congratulations for the marvelous papers. And so I had two questions for Louise, and one question for Louise, Ronald, and Gwendoline. So, Louise, which was the space of magic and its practitioners on Northern courts, and which role the gender issue played in that scenario? And the question for all of you, how do you see the use of magical ideas by the alt-right?
The place for practicing magic.
Yes, to
Yes.
practice and for the practitioners.
Yes, I think what is striking about the Danish witch trials is that magic is very verbal. It's very much about threatening people. You'll be damned if you will ever talk to me like that again, or if you will ever say that, I will make sure you will not live for long, something like that. But of course, they practiced magical rituals, but in the sources, we rarely hear about it. It's mostly that so they did something in secrecy. So they're not very rich in informing us about the rituals, the Danish tribes. You need to search elsewhere for them in mythologies and places. But in my Italian studies, there are very detailed descriptions about magic. And I should probably say, because the reason that we don't get these descriptions in the Danish source materials is that what counts as evidence is that you pose that threat of evil. So that's, of course, what the scribe and the witnesses and the judges are interested in. But the Italian inquisitors are very much interested in the rituals and where they did it and how they did it, and were they kneeling, and were they lighting church candles and these kinds of things. And that would usually be in their own kitchens almost. As that would be at home, but they could also meet magic or magical rituals, or sort of traces of, I'm not sure that's the right word, but you could see, for instance, the black dog. You could meet the black dog on your way towards whatever, the market, something. So I think the key word in the Italian trials and also in the Danish trials that I've been looking into is that this is something that goes on in secrecy, and that people cannot hear it. If they witness it, they cannot hear what they talk about. It's mumbling, and every time, or if you come into a room and you just walk out again, that could be suspicious. These kinds of things where people cannot really recognize, oh, what are they doing, are usually what gives suspicion. Then, of course, in the Danish trials, it's very much on these meetings with devils are on cemeteries. It's in the evenings, at nighttime when it's dark, but it's not. I don't. And of course, on the top of hills, these kinds of things where they can be dancing and having the party with the devil. But it's very various. But I don't have evidence of the circles and the characters and these kinds of things in the Danish sources, but I know that you can find them elsewhere. And then I think I'll pass the word on to some of you with the joint question.
I'm happy to answer for a British and wider European position on the specific connection between alt-right and occultism and paganism. I've often heard it said that there is such a connection, but I don't really think there is a special one, because what you find across modern Europe is that a minority of magicians, speaking in modern terms, and modern pagans embrace far-right positions, but most do not. I think it would be more helpful to say that modern occultism and paganism is an interest very often for avant-garde intellectuals of all kinds. And so, for example, modern paganism is often associated with left-wing countercultures and a minority of it with right-wing. Very often I hear there's a special connection between the Nazis and occultism and paganism, but that's really a smear tactic to use against occultism and paganism, because the Nazis banned paganism along with Freemasonry and Druidry in their Reich. The only Nazi to have been interested in paganism personally was Himmler, who was regarded as an eccentric by his colleagues. So if there is a connection between paganism, magic, and extreme politics, it actually spans the spectrum. But because we are more afraid in Europe, and I think justly, of extreme right political groups than of left-wing political groups, the link is noticed rather more there.
Yeah, I think I can only agree with what Ronald was saying. I did attend a talk a couple of years ago about the sort of specific medievalism of runes, where the speaker did mention that this sort of corner of paganism and the occult had a bit of a foothold in Nazi Germany, with a specific example of a runology exercise book, which interesting. But I mean, aside from that little tidbit, yes, I can only agree with what Ronald said.
Okay, I guess that answers the question, right? So, Richard, if you could please unmute.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the three speakers. Thoroughly enjoyed all three presentations. In many respects, I'm a bit of an interloper here. I'm a devil guy, not particularly a witch guy. But I would like to touch on the fear theme that has come up. Both Louise and Ronald, you touched on this, and the conversation was gravitating that direction as it was. Back in 2008, I organized a fairly large conference on the history of the devil in pre-modern Europe, and had about 200 people. Many international scholars who were actually genuinely quite frightened, quite worried maybe, about telling customs officials and passport control people what it was they were going to attend. It seems that there is a real urgency to our field, which has developed since I've been involved. I mean, it seems to me to have got worse anyway. Where people are identifying the research with the researcher and assuming that people are practitioners at some level. At the same time, I also often get, and Louise alluded to a similar sort of thing, really impassioned, worried emails from people who are plagued by Satan in their life. And what, as an academic, can I do to suggest ways of freeing themselves from the devil's hold? And in the current context, particularly in North America, where I am, where satanic conspiracies abound once again, I constantly wonder what should we be doing to counter these fairly pernicious and worrying trends, and this revival of fear of witches, fear of demons, and so on. Thank you.
Yeah, who wants to go first?
I can say for my behalf that that I give a lot of public lectures, and I'm often invited to all sorts of I'm not sure what you call it in English, but parish council, something like that, congregation councils, these kinds of things, and also open universities and public, all kinds of things. I think and usually I accept, and I think that's one thing that I can do, because I get these two kinds of emails. I get one kind that are worried about witches and the dark arts, and then I get the other one, which is usually an older man explaining the world to me. I think and not an academic. But I think to me anyway, I think the important thing is to give a lot of lectures, because that's what I can do, and to participate when I'm invited to join in panels, not more public panels. I also think that in Denmark it's probably not as intense as somewhere as elsewhere. I think that's. I don't know what you think, Ronald and Gwendolyn.
I'm deferring to Gwendolyn. I have things to say, but I'm happy to be last, which is how I was in the speeches.
Fair enough. I mean, I'm in a slightly odd position there, because I do not identify as a practicing witch, but as you can see, I do wear a bit of black, and I do kind of embody the stereotype just a little bit. See the aforementioned research assistant as well, and I almost feel like walking that kind of balance between, to a certain degree, fulfilling the stereotype that people have of what I should look like, but at the same time not upholding the stereotype of what I believe and what I am. It gives me a little bit of an inroad with people, because they're unsettled just enough that I can kind of get in and say, let me tell you a little bit about this thing that I do, that I know. And yeah, otherwise just kind of and engaging with people in good faith. The people that I encounter, of course, don't tend to be the ones who are terribly concerned about concerned about witchcraft and devil worship. They tend to lean more towards the modern witches and neo-pagan end of the scale. But yeah, just engaging with people in good faith is at the moment really the best I can do, I think. One of the more interesting experiences that I have had was I was invited to be a panelist at back when I lived in Vienna, of something called Theology on Tap, which was the Anglican Church in Vienna periodically does these little events where they have two of the priests and then sort of an extra expert person, and I joined them for magic, superstition, and the occult one autumn, and I had prepared so much of kind of like medieval witchcraft and superstition and things, and then I wound up sounding more like an anthropological neurobiologist talking about how people engage with superstitions in the present day. So you never know. But yeah, that's the best solution that I've managed to come up with at the moment anyway.
I think we can do things, Richard, and I engage in this quite extensively at national, international level, and also what I'd call the bizarre level. Quick example of each. National level, I have for many years acted as an advisor to the police, to the caring services, to the National Health Service, and to the educational system in cases where people have suffered damage because of a reputation of being a witch or a pagan or both, and I know managed to get people reinstated to their jobs, not have their children taken away and things like that by providing expert testimony. Very often I provide testimony in legal cases, and it's a sign of how things are improving that whereas for the first 10 years, I was always brought in for the defense, if the person on trial was an occultist or a pagan, to explain to the jury that being an occultist or a pagan did not necessarily automatically make you a criminal. For the last 10 years, I've been brought in mostly by the prosecution, asked by the police to explain to the jury that the fact that somebody is an occultist or a pagan does not actually justify them in committing a crime. So I think that the balance of opinion there is swinging rather healthily. International level, I wrote a book called The Witch, which called for an international effort to end witch hunting. It helped inspire a conference at Lancaster University with United Nations representatives to frame a motion for the United Nations Human Rights Council. And that motion was duly framed and it got passed last July, officially making it the policy of the United Nations to act against harm caused to people because of beliefs concerning magic. And that's the beginning of a global movement to end witch hunting in the modern world, where it's still a serious problem. The bizarre side I do get written to by people who think they're bewitched and who are clearly in considerable distress. And the temptation to shy away and say this isn't my kind of thing is very strong, but I'm too much of a coward to want to be thought a coward. And so I do respond. And I generally try to find out a bit about the person and what their situation is. And the basic message I try and drive home by one route or another is the worldwide fact that if you don't fear magic, it can't harm you. And to give them a sense of being able to build up their own confidence and their own resources against the fear, and so neutralize the threat. And that does seem to work quite well as far as I can see. So in a sense, I'm acting as a cunning man by giving that sort of advice, but in another sense, I'm within the bounds of academic competence and rationalism.
Thank you very much. Thank you both, all three of you.
Can I just a tiny short remark? I think that is it's disturbing and fascinating at the same time, Ronald. I think also that's much more intense than you would, I think, ever see in Denmark. We have a society stripped of religion and magic. I think what I encounter is, and that is just recently, I participated in a very sort of very famous Danish radio show with a psychologist, and afterwards, and I talked about the enchantment of the world and disenchantment and re-enchantment, and afterwards I was I'm not sure how you say that, but I was on email, on telephone, and my daughter's telephone as well. In Denmark we call them Jehovah's Vidner. Do you know them, Gwen? The last
Jehovah's
sort of, yes, exactly. And they were just spamming me, honestly, because they thought that I needed to be saved. So they thought that I was the poor thing I needed to be saved because I could not research these topics without being damned. So we don't have anything like the cases you describe, Ronald.
Thank you, everyone.
And I would just like to make a quick comment here. And I think it shows that this is a very successful roundtable, that the moderator didn't have to ask any questions so far. But I think it's quite peculiar, this topic of discussion of not only fear of witchcraft and the occult, but this satanic panic that Ronald mentioned, started in the US in the 90s, and how, at least here in Brazil, this seems to be returning in a sense, or at least some groups are pushing for its return. And I'll just give a quick example that the Brazilian audience may identify with. But on Halloween night, which, by the way, Halloween is not a holiday in Brazil. It's not a big thing. People do celebrate it, but it's nothing major. But on Halloween night, on a TV network, which is owned by a Protestant church, which also happens to be very far right, they did a news coverage about the dangers of Halloween and the hidden pagan origins of Halloween. And this is interesting because, I mean, they always said that, but it seems they're pushing it harder now. They also did a special coverage about the dangers and devil worshipping things on anime. So, yeah, if you could comment on this, if Ronald, if you think that there is a movement in the sense to bring back the satanic panic, especially with this rise of a very caricaturesque far right in places like the United States.
I can soothe you a bit by saying that I don't think this is an increasing problem. On the other hand, I think it's going to be a perennial problem, because just as there's nothing inherent in the teaching of Islam that predisposes people towards holy war and unbelievers, yet there are teachings in Islam which can justify those actions on behalf of those who are themselves predisposed towards them. So there's always a frontier of evangelical Christianity which is going to need demons, because they're there in so much traditional Christian literature. And they have to be explained away in modern terms to prevent a literal belief in them and a need in believers to act against them. So if you have traditional texts which themselves entirely justify a particular belief, then the only recourses that can be built against them, although they're quite powerful recourses, are civic laws introduced by the non-religious society to stop people doing harm to each other, which can restrain religious prejudice and violence and hate crime. And also powerful established churches who've had time to work through all this. Because when this sort of thinking appears, and it's all over the West, including my country, the people propagating it are never now leaders of the Church of England, the Roman Catholic Church, or even the older dissenting churches like the Quakers or the Baptists or the United Reformed Church. They're always recently formed extreme Protestant sects who depend on the Bible as their main source of authority, joined with what they would call the Holy Spirit and what I would call instinct. And this is always going to be there. It's a frontier of Christianity. And as long as we have, as I've said, these counter forces to contain and cope with it, it can be kept within check.
Thank you. And I totally agree with this, that this is almost inevitable, and perhaps here in Brazil, we need to push harder to guarantee these legal boundaries. Well, anyways, Lucas has a question, and then I have a question, but Lucas first. And then there's a question in chat as well. Lucas?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Nice. So usually a wizard is never late, but today I was a little late. And I got Gwendolyn's talk in the middle, and I don't know if you already addressed this question, but there is a connection in all of your thoughts and talks about witchery, witchcraft, witch hunting, and the idea of paganism. And I think maybe there is too little a clear definition of paganism, as it is such a huge concept that can be employed to anything, actually. And so I would like to hear a little more about how this generalization of everything that is not myself is pagan actually reinforces the idea of persecution of the other, of demonizing the other, and so on. I hope that is not another huge conference you have to make, but I would like to hear a little bit about this, because it's a topic that I am researching right now, and I'm looking into maybe write something about what is actually paganism in the High Middle Ages or something like that.
I can maybe hop in here first. I mean, I think that how you phrase it kind of really says a lot about the topic itself. It's really the idea of paganism that is kind of what we're dealing with here. I mean, the majority of sources that I'm dealing with that engage with heathendom or paganness on any kind of meaningful level are doing so in a context of, so to speak, a Christian frontier, and in a context where this identity creation, this kind of group demarcation, is almost more important than any kind of active persecution. I mean, this doesn't mean that there's not a certain degree of demonization of the other that's taking place, but I think that the idea of the pagan and the purpose that they serve in the texts that I'm dealing with are quite different. In, for example, the early Middle Ages, between the early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, and other periods, it changes quite significantly through time, the majority of the legal material that I deal with that is from the High Middle Ages. Of course, in Graugaus, it is quite explicitly within framed as, one should believe in God and not do all of these things which are not which do not belong to proper Christian belief. But by and large, the engagement with sort of paganness or heathendom as a concept is rather low. So yes, I'm not sure how well I've actually answered your question, but I can leave the floor to Louisa and Ronald.
Do you want to go next, Louise?
Yes, just very briefly. I think that very, very briefly, the Italian trials I've looked into is not witchcraft is entirely dealt with as heresy, and heretics are Christian. So that leaves pagans in another category. As for the Danish material, the Turks are pagans, the Muslims are pagans, but they're not considered witches. If you have to link witchcraft to another confessional society, it would be the calling, the name calling of Catholics as Catholicism, or the papist beliefs as witchcraft, but it's not to be confused with village witchcraft. So I don't think that in a Danish context, that is early modern context, that is in fact sort of a question that is relevant, or if you understand what I mean. So it's not really something that is dealt with. It's because people are Christian, and people are after 1536 they are Lutheran evangelical, even if they don't think so. That is what they are. So, and witches are found among parishioners in local society.
Both Gwendolyn and Louise have, I think, covered the medieval early modern dimension very well. So I'll just say a little more about the terminology. That I think that the use of the term pagan can have both precision and utility among scholars to denote the pre-Christian religions of Europe and the Near East. And that is a category of religion, and it's one that by definition has its own uses. And it's entirely proper to speak about modern pagans, therefore, as people who are inspired by ideas and images taken from the pre-Christian religions of Europe and the Near East. But there's a whole lot of mess and there's a whole lot of baggage. The mess is that in modern times, pagan's been extended as a term to mean irreligion, an absence of belief, very often, instead of expressing a particular type of religious tradition. And it also, in English, it has a kind of naughty but nice Victorian connotation. So Thomas Hardy, the famous novelist, uses the term pagan 3 times in his novel, The Return of the Native. And in each case, it means sexy, fringe, should be forbidden, but maybe not, risque, those connotations. And the baggage is that paganism and Satanism are the 2 great significant others for Christianity. And so there's a huge pejorative shadow that hangs over pagan and paganism even now for many people. The other problem, which I think does leak into the issues in which Louise and Gwendolyn are centrally interested, is how far we see paganism at all after the conversion to Christianity. Because it seems now generally agreed there's no surviving paganism in medieval Christian Europe, no self-conscious, well-organized or even organized counter-religion to Christianity carrying on the old ways. On the other hand, there's an enormous number of what you might call pagan survivals. That's images and ideas taken over from the pagan ancient world into the Christianity of each region. Although scholars may squabble over precisely whether one or another phenomenon or object or idea is a pagan survival. So when you put together that bundle of phenomena, there's room for a huge amount of confusion and some really, really interesting conversations trying to sort out ways in which we can work together and work with the public.
Thank you very much for your answers. This was most enlightening.
Hey, thank you, Lucas, for the question. Now, we have a question in chat. So I'm just gonna read it aloud for the YouTube video, which is for Louise. And Leo Lynch asks, is there a direct line from pre-Christian charms or rituals or magic to the type of thing a 16th century village cunning person or witch might be doing?
I think I can answer this in a very big way, or a broad way, or a very brief way. I think there is a line. I don't know if it's direct, because I think what's important is that it fuses with Christianity. So most of the charms that we have that we know of are sort of traditional or magical, or even pagan, if we look at it from a Christian perspective, words and sentences, but fusing with Christian words or prayers, or so I think I'm not sure if it's direct, but there are indeed roots, pre-Christian roots, old Nordic roots, I would say.
There even is such a thing as a direct line when talking history, right?
I think we that is a phrase that I try not to use. I was once a sociologist proposed that there was a direct line from Martin Luther to the witch hunt. So no, not really. But but it's no, I don't really use that phrase that much.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? And just a quick reminder for everyone in the audience who has registered and who is currently in Brazil, we will be giving away a book at the very end, so stay in the room. But if you have any questions, please raise your hands. In the meantime, I have a question, which I guess it's for all three, but maybe especially for Louise and Ronald, which is about one of the, perhaps the most well-known book about witchcraft here in Brazil, because it's one of the very few was translated. Probably, I could be wrong, but probably in terms of an entire book, one of the very, very few translated to Portuguese, which is Caliban and the Witch, which, and I'm saying the word witch so many times it's getting weird, but which Louise already mentioned in her talk. And it does an association, which many scholars from that talk about modern history are very critical of, because it perhaps, and again, I don't, this is not my field of expertise, so I'm sorry if I'm butchering some ideas here, but they say she projects some contemporary ideals on a medieval/modern background. And I wanted to ask about, well, first the issues of doing that, but also why is that so popular? And hitching on that question of why is that so popular, and going to the point that Louise made, but also Gwendolyn, that most condemned and judged by witchcraft are women. Why women? And if Caliban and the Witch perhaps traces a quote unquote bad correlation between the history of witchcraft and gender, or history of women at least, what would be a better interpretation of it? And I know that's a very question, sorry.
You first, Louise.
Oh, I was actually hoping you would go first, because I was actually quite curious to hear what I have some I have my opinions on it, but this is recorded. So I was curious to hear what your views on this are.
Well, there are two questions. There's the specific one about a specific recent author and her impact, and a broader one about the relationship between gender and witchcraft beliefs. The specific one is that there's no mystery about why this particular writer has proved so popular, because what she does in very vivid and accessible terms is combine Marxism and feminism to denounce capitalism and patriarchy, using the witch hunts in a way which any 18th century philosopher or 19th century radical liberal would recognize to castigate forces of the older society. My only problem with her hypothesis is simply that it's wrong. It's back to front. You do not find witch hunting starting in or most intense in the most capitalist areas of Europe. On the contrary, the most developed capitalism is in places like the Netherlands and London, and in the Italian cities of the 16th century rather than the 15th, which are precisely the areas that either don't have witch hunting or stop it soonest. Whereas it's most intense in exactly the areas that don't have developed capitalism and persist longest. So as a historical hypothesis, it is simply wrong. But then the author is not anything resembling a historian. She is a retired political scientist with her eye firmly on the present day. So as a work of modern political polemic, it's extremely clever and extremely effective. As for the wider connection between witchcraft and gender, the vast majority of people tried as witches across Europe were female because the peoples concerned had thought the great majority of magicians, especially rogue magicians, were female since the ancient world. To the ancient Romans, the ancient Germans, stereotypically, witches are female. And where you have these prehistoric beliefs, the people whom the common people automatically identify as witches when they make the vital accusations are going to be female. Wherever you have older traditions that clash with this, then you get a majority of men, or a lot of men, accused instead. In areas which had shamanic beliefs, as I define them, like the Baltic states and Finland, you have a lot of men. In areas where magic is concerned with the casting of runes, with writing, like Iceland, it's 93% male in the execution rate. In Normandy, it's shepherds who are regarded as the magical people, the rogue magicians, and they're male, so it's shepherds who are executed as witches. In the Austrian lands, it's vagrants who tend to be male. Now, this is actually quite a lot of space in Europe, but nonetheless, the majority of Europeans traditionally believe that women were the magical sex. Men could learn magic from books or from teachers. Women just had it in them, which is why they tended to come on as prophetesses, sibyls, pythonesses, at times when men couldn't get the answers for things. And when they wanted to do magic, they could just do it because it's inherent in them. And that's a belief which feeds directly into the early modern witch hunts. So in a sense, I just booted the whole problem about 1,000 years further back, or maybe 2,000. But I really do believe that's where it starts.
I wish I could I could speak so precisely and sophisticated about it. I very much agree, Ronald, and also just an example from the Danish realms, which is sort of adding to the examples that Ronald gave, is then in northern Norway, you have quite intense prosecutions in the Finnmark, and you have ethnic Norwegian or Danish, if you want, women and Sami men. so that's adds to your argument. And also about I very much agree with you regarding the said book and the said author. We have an example in Scandinavia with a Swedish author who's done a sort of a similar book, but it's only been spread to Denmark and Norway and Sweden. But it's been the same case where you every time you talk to people outside academia, this book has it's been so popular that you need to say, where do you know these things from? And I say, oh, I read this book. And you say, oh, well, put it in the fireplace. I agree that the Caliban and the Witch and the author of it is, she has a political project. She's not a historian. She's not doing a historical study. She has a political project that she's lies forward in this book and wraps it in history or a historical work. So I agree.
Okay, Gwen, do you have anything to?
Nope, I don't really have anything to add there. I'm good.
Okay, thank you for this. That was actually fascinating, because while I certainly know that witch persecution was not exclusive to female, and in certain contexts it could be the opposite, this correlation between other types of magic, perhaps like shamans, and being more predominantly male / females, is really fascinating. But then again, I'm a bit out of my field here, so perhaps I'm just gasping at something very obvious, and I'm like, oh. So forgive me if that's the case. We do have question in chat, which again I will read for the record. Still thinking about Louis' question about the relationship between gender issues and witch hunt. Are there any indications that one could be accused of being a witch if they broke social rules regarding gender roles? I don't mean the strong woman fighting against patriarchy type, but more towards a situation where targeted practices more towards situations where targeted practice as rough music or Karivari, women that hit for their men, for example. I'm sorry if I got that a bit mangled, but that's an interesting question actually, and it's for all of you, so go ahead.
Okay, yeah.
Please, yes, you can. Please start. You go.
Okay, I was in last time. I'll bowl ahead now, and then I can sit back and shut up. I've just been reviewing 2 superb, hot off the press books, which are detailed case studies of particular local witch hunts. One by John Callow of the Bideford witches, the last alleged witches to be executed for sure in England, and the other by Malcolm Gaskill of the witch hunt at Springfield in New England, across the Atlantic. And they bring home very strongly, because they're such well-documented cases, the way in which there is no association between women breaking social rules of gender and witch accusations, because the accusations tend to arise, many of them, within the sphere of women. So these often begin as a tension between women. And they're not a tension between women who are accusing others of not behaving properly as women should. They're tensions because the crimes which are associated with witches are often centered on the home. They're the bewitching of children. They're the destruction of the livestock in the infield. They're making the roof catch fire. They are making the butter churn stop working. And some of the most intense rivalries are between people in the center of the village community who are often female. To put it bluntly, when early modern people turn nasty, men tend to hit with their fists, and women more often use words. And words can be deadly, where you believe in the efficacy of cursing, but also where accusations are traded. So there really doesn't seem to be a strong correlation between accusations of witchcraft and women failing to satisfy normative gender roles. Women who are accused are those who fail to satisfy roles in other ways, in that they tend to be a nuisance as beggars, but more often they tend to be menacing. They're sharp-tongued. They do curse. They threaten people. They're the neighbors from hell. Those people are extremely likely to attract the accusations.
I agree. And that is exactly what we find in the Danish sources as well. And I might add that actually the phrase of being a good neighbor is a phrase that you hear when people are defending, or when a husband, for instance, is defending his wife for witchcraft. Then he brings in witnesses witnessing that she is a good neighbor, and she is a good Christian, and she's a good it's called Dannekvinde. Also, I think that in the Danish trials, you find that transgressive behavior, not the same as loose women or something like that, but transgressive behavior as hitting your husband or shouting or showing anger, that is always emphasized, but it's not what it's not the same as every angry woman would be brought to trial. So I think that that's an important point to make, and I agree with everything. And you got to read Malcolm's new book, Ronald. I am very envious. It's not out yet, so I look very much forward to reading it.
I think this is one area where, as someone working with predominantly early medieval sources, I'm a little bit jealous, because I don't have the kind of court records that you both are talking about in these more kind of early modern contexts, which makes this question difficult for me to answer, because I don't see very many actual accusations of witchcraft going forward, and often when I see in sources such as penitentials that there can be connections drawn between sort of transgressive behavior of women, but that's usually in connection with, for example, how they for example, doing something with your child in order to cure them of a particular fever, for example, and references to divination or magic or what have you are just as likely to reference the specific practices rather than identifying the kind of people who are likely to do them as not. So it's this particular question is a very, very difficult one for me to really answer in such a way that I won't just draw us on until another half hour.
Okay, so I think we're at a good point to end, and hence we have only one more question. So I'm just going to read this final question, and then I'll proceed to do a giveaway and some shout outs and shameless merchandise. And so the final question, which again, I think could really go to the three of you, and it goes back to the question about what can we do and about what I could call here perhaps public history. And it goes as up to the 90s, there was still a lot of violence in places, and the person in question, which is Sarah, cites an example of South Africa, directed to practitioners of what was perceived as witchcraft. And I think we could add Brazil to the list with some African based religions here, which are called witchcraft by many people in the common sense. And it was done in the time, a report about how to act about in these cases and how to stop this violence. So she wanted to know how we can apply, how we can, what we can do in cases like that without, and trying to, I think it goes back to what Ronald talked about, and trying to conciliate the perhaps almost inherent cultural differences and cultural hatred that goes with it, that to a certain extent we have to balance and tolerate. So that's it. Anyone wants to go first?
This is right in my home territory. I have actually very little to add because I've spoken about this quite a lot already. So I'll simply reiterate, this is a huge problem. It didn't peak in the 1990s. It's getting worse in areas of the world like Papua New Guinea, Melanesia, areas of tribal India, areas of Southeast Asia, and some African countries. If you want to attend a witch trial at the present day, then just go to Malawi, Cameroon, Ghana, or Saudi Arabia. And if you go to Saudi Arabia, you can have the added experience of seeing convicted witches put to death. In the other countries I've named, they are fined or imprisoned instead. But their neighbors still murder them wherever they can. So this is a serious problem. So number one, UN resolution, which we've now got as of last July, which should be global action. Number two, those fire breaks or ramparts or barriers within society against the unleashing of bigotry, an impartial judicial system with laws that restrain violence and the preaching of hatred against fellow citizens, and coupled with alliances between modern liberal governments and established churches to restrain some of the excess enthusiasm of religious believers. By churches, I'm speaking as a Westerner, but of course it's imams or it's Sufi leaders, or it's leaders of Buddhist or Shinto or Hindu or a range of other traditional faiths in those countries concerned. You can't do this in a secular theatre alone. You've got to be able to engage on the territory of religion itself.
I'm very, I have really got nothing to add. This is a part of witchcraft that I honestly and a bit embarrassing stay away from, because I think it's so heartbreaking. And the reason that I can keep it together with reading the old sources is that it takes me so long to read the sources, and the times that I've been to conferences with anthropologians showing pictures from Papua New Guinea or Nigeria, I think it's horrible, and it makes my heartbreak, and it makes I'm really impressed and that about the work that you do, Ronald, and also there's a Danish woman who has an orphanage for witch children in Nigeria, and I'm just filled with sort of warm feelings for people working with this, but I find it so horrible and heartbreaking that I cannot. I think yes, it's just horrible, and I think just reading the sources from the 16th and 17th centuries makes me cry. So I cannot imagine how this kind of work must be like.
Yes, I think I'm in a very similar boat to you, Louisa, and also very impressed by the work that you're doing, Ronald, in this contemporary sphere. I almost have the feeling, you know, because my work in this regard is so specialized to a particular time and place, that it would be an act of extreme hubris for me to presume that I could speak competently to this present day problem. I wish I could. I wish that I, you know, had the competence and the confidence in order to do so. But I mean, at the place where I am at the moment, it genuinely staggers me.
Okay, that was a somber tone to end, I guess, but a very appropriate one, I believe, especially to the name of the roundtable. So just before I do the final thanks and we close it, I would like to give away to our Brazilian audience, unfortunately only to Brazilian audiences, 2 copies. So we're gonna do an extra giveaway of Dr. Hutton's book, which unfortunately is the only book of the 3 authors here who is translated to Portuguese. And it is this very beautiful, perhaps fetishized even, edition by Moderna, by Macabra, I'm sorry. And it also comes with a small notebook, and it's all very fancy. So to do the giveaway, I have a list here of Brazilian people who have registered and who are still present in that call. And I'm just going to ask Ronald to give me 2 numbers, and I'm going to read the respective names in this list.
Numbers out of how many?
1 to 50.
17.
I'm sorry. Okay. But let's do 1 to 30 because we only have 31 people in the room anyways. 17 is the first one.
And 24.
Okay, just give me a second. In the meantime, I think Gwendolyn has an announcement / call for papers to make.
Yes, I had requested the opportunity to exploit this platform just a little bit for a call for papers. I am helping to organize a panel or multiple panels for the upcoming ANZA MEMS conference. So that's the Australian and New Zealand Society for Medieval and Early Modern Studies. I think I got that backwards. I think it's Early Modern and Medieval Studies. Anyway, our panel is involves the overlap of the history of emotions and the history of witchcraft. And if anyone in the audience or among the panelists is interested in submitting an abstract, I would be more than happy to share the call for papers with you. I think it's a little bit long for the chat, but I have popped the editor email in the chat here. And the journal, if you want to find it, is called Care, which I've now also put in the chat. We would be more than happy to hear from you and have you with us in our panel. And that was my little shameless plug. Thank you very much.
Okay, and so I would like to announce that Natalia Martins Luna and Sarah Schneider de Bittencourt are our lucky viewers, I guess. So please, both of you, contact me or Gam later so we can arrange for the books. And you can also choose the cover because there is the black edition and there is a white edition as well. And having said that, I would like to thank you all for being here and all people from all over the world actually who have registered and participated today. We had people from Turkey, Israel, Russia, the United States, Denmark, Sweden, and India, if I'm not wrong. So yeah, I think if there is a positive side to this virtual talk thing is how global we can get. And I would like to thank Professor Putton and apologize to him again for all the trouble we gave you with Zoom, but also for participating with us and presenting an amazing talk. And also for Professor Louise for bringing a very, how should I say, a very Danish perspective. And here at GAM, we do have a strong connection with the Danish, I guess. We have quite the audience there for specific reasons that we've invited a couple people from there. And so it's always good to have people from Denmark. And again, an amazing paper on a very unknown subject here, I believe. So I guess a lot of people learned a lot today. And finally, I would like to thank Gwendolyn, who not only delivered a great paper, but also helped envision and conceive and execute this whole roundtable, because it was not only my idea. So she is my partner in crime here, I guess. So thank you all very, very much. And if anyone has any final considerations, please go ahead.
Thanks for organizing. It was really fun.
Yes, congratulations, Luis and Gwendolyn, on a wonderful evening, at least by my time. And I don't think we're ending on a somber note. I think it's actually quite upbeat, an affirmation of what we can do and are doing.
Yes, and thank you both for participating in the roundtable, and thank you, Louise, for approaching me to organize this as well. This was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed participating.
Okay, so I will